Welcome back. In this video, I want to cover the grid component we have in the page builder editor. It is the component that you will use as a skeleton to organize the content on your page. So it is crucial to master this specific element and have a really good understanding of how it works. So let's get started by adding an empty block. And when we add an empty block, we automatically get a grid inside this block. So the grid, essentially, it is a single component, but it's composed of a child and a parent in components in a way. So every grid has at least one cell inside it, right? And we can only place the content inside a cell. We can't place content inside a grid, all right? But let's focus just on the grid first. So the grid, when we select it, it's got grid size, grid settings as the most important properties, style properties that we can control. So on the grid size, we have a few predefined templates that you can use. So for example, if I want a grid with 2 cells, I can just click here and then I get 2 cells, right? And they are roughly both 50% in size. Now, the size of a cell is actually determined by the number of columns. Usually grid systems work with columns, and we use a 12-column grid system. You can kind of educate yourself a bit more about the grid systems by just Googling grid systems and columns. But roughly, when we say, like in this case, because we use a 12-column grid system, the size of this cell is 6, and the size of this cell is 6 columns, right? So we can make this column smaller by selecting this template, right? But we got more control than that. Let's go back to this where we have both cells of equal size, and we can then make some finer adjustments by using these two options here. Column 1 is controlling the first cell, and column 2 is controlling the second cell. So we can make the first cell smaller, right? So we can make it like this, and the second one larger. And again, when you hit 12 as a sum, you can't make it any larger than that, right? So if I want to make the first one larger, I need to first remove the size, reduce the size of the second one, and then I can make this one larger. Now, we have here cells, but we have here columns. And the reason for that is that by default, when you insert a grid, it's gonna have a single row. But we can add more rows to the grid, right? So now if we say make this one smaller and this one larger, we control all of the cells inside the first column, or as well as inside the second column, right? So here we have a grid with 4 columns and with 4 rows, 2 columns, and each column has equal size. If we need more columns, we can just select more columns here. All right, so that was about the grid size. Now, inside grid settings, we got a couple of options. First of all, oftentimes you want to have some, let's say, padding or margin besides two cells, so there's some white space in between. It just makes it visually nicer. You can do that in multiple ways. You can select a cell and then add paddings or margins to that cell. So for example, we can say, hey, I want 10 pixels around this cell. So you can see how this one now has that padding added to it. And by the way, this padding and margin property is available on a lot of elements. And how it works is when you have this link green, it means that if I type in 10 here, it applies to all 4 sides of that element. So all 4 sides will have 10 pixels of padding, right? I can also change the unit to other options, but in case I want to control each side individually, I can just unlink that and I can say, hey, I want 10 pixels on top, but 5 pixels on the sides, right? Make it smaller. But in this case, let's just put that back to 0. And it's the same way is how the margin property works. But imagine now having 12 cells and needing to do that 12 times. It's quite tedious, right? So if you go back to the grid and on the grid settings, we've got the column and row gap, right? So let's add 25 pixels here. Column and row is working pixels here. So this is going to add 25 pixels of gap between the columns, right? And if you want to do the same thing on the horizontal level, that is between rows, we can just add that, right? And now we have a nice separation between our cells, and it took just a second to do it, right? All right, now the other options here are more to do with the control of how the grid is going to behave inside a mobile responsive environment. So let me just clean this grid a bit. I'm going to go back to 2 and just back into two rows, right? So you can see, let's paint these cells. Let's have an orange cell and let's have a green cell, right? So we have two cells. And if we go to the mobile view, you see how these cells automatically are no longer inside a single line, but they wrap one under each other. This is the default behavior you see on many mobile websites, and we introduced this behavior to you by default, right? It just saves a ton of time if you need to make your own mobile responsive page. But in certain cases, you maybe don't want this behavior, right? You don't want one cell to go under another cell. So in those cases, what you can do is first on the column wrap, you can select no wrap, and we just need to flip this option into a match grid height. And this is going to get us into this behavior where both cells are inside the same line. Right, so like here. So that's about that grid settings, and there's more to that. For example, if I want to change the direction, for example, let's go back here. There's another option that I want to show you, which is, hey, by default, I've got my orange on the left and green on the right. But when I go to the mobile, I don't want the orange to go on top. I actually want the orange to go on the bottom, right? So I can then flip this wrap direction to reverse. This way it changes. A typical use case is, for example, on a lot of websites, you see content organized in a way, here's an image, here's some text. That's one block. And then under that, there's another block where instead of having an image on the left, the image is on the right and the text is on the left, right? So it's nicer to read. But then when you move into the mobile view, you don't want to have image, text, text, image, right? You want image, text, image, text. And this is exactly the use case where you would then control that wrap direction. Now, I'm going to touch base on the column height in a second. For that, first what we need to do is control the height of a grid. By default, you'll find it to 100%, but let's make a grid height of 500 for now. And now, when you have that, if we flip this into no wrap regular, so you'll see how this changes in a second. Let's add some content inside this cell. Let's add some content inside this cell. So now that we have some content inside, we also just need to add another row, because the behavior I want to show you that it only works in a grid with multiple rows. So let's say we have 2 rows here. So you see here how these cells are of equal height, but actually the content inside them is not equal, right? Now, okay, of course, there's use cases when you want the cells in a specific row to be of equal height. So if we now were to add let's say another cell here, you will see that the selection of that cell is of equal height as these first 2. So in the current grid settings, all of the cells inside a single row will be of equal height. So for example, if we add some content here, right, you'll see that this automatically made the other cells inside this row match its height. So for example, let's add a color here just so you can orient yourself. And if we were to add more text here, you'll see how the other cells, see, they match the size of the highest cell inside of that row. Now we can change that behavior so that the size of the cell matches the cell content. To do that, we would select the grid, and inside the grid settings, instead of column height match grid height, it's going to be content size. So now you see that each cell has the size of the content inside of it, right? They're no longer all of equal size. So this is that other property that is important to have a good understanding of. Okay, so let's now clear this grid, and let's just add a new grid here. Right. The other option that is often handy is nesting grids. So you can have a grid inside of a grid inside of a grid, right? So here I have a grid and a cell, and let's say I want to add another grid in here, right? So you can see now in the structure, I've got a cell inside a grid and cell inside a grid. So this way you can have a more in-depth control, because you can control the grid, the inner grid and the outer grid. For example, let's do a cool use case. Let's make the width, or let's make the height of this block to be 800 pixels, right? So we got that. And let's say I want to have a subtext text, and then under that text I want to have a primary call to action, a secondary call to action, right? So for me to do that, what I can do is something very simple. I can go to the parent grid, and I can say that I want to have, so I got 3 rows. I got a row for subtext, I got a row for text, and then I'm going to have a row for the call to action. So let's add 3 rows. So here I'll have that nested grid, but let's delete it for now. And here I'll have, so let's have that subtext. Let's make it orange. It's gonna, whatever, right? Let's have a text here. Let's just leave it as it is, right? And here I want to have, as I mentioned, primary call to action and secondary, but inside the same line. If I try to do that with a single cell, it won't work. It won't work because I can't place an item on the right hand side. I can only place the items on the top or the bottom. Now, to get the desired behavior, what I can do is go into this cell and actually add another grid. All right. So that inner grid, I can then split into two. And now I can have one button here and another button there. Right. So I got that behavior, right? Which is, and then I can, let's say, align them. Hey, I want this one here, I want this one there, but inside that grid, I want to add 25 pixels of gap. And then I can make this one, let's say, primary, and this one can just be a simple link, right? Again, going into mobile, you'll see we wrap the cells underneath each other, but you see here that, well, because I've aligned this one to the right and this one to the left, doesn't look quite good. But luckily, if I go here, the horizontal aligned property is based on the device, so I can just say, hey, center aligned, right? So I get it like this on mobile, and I get it like this on desktop, right? But okay, so that's one point I wanted to show you. Now, the other point is that we have, because we have this block that is, we did 800 pixels of height. I want to make this grid so it's always in the, let's say, the middle of position in the middle of that block, right? So what I can do here is just say, hey, align this to the center, right? So this makes my grid in the center of that block. So it's just nicer to the user, right? So that's one option. The other option that is, so let's clear this for now. The other option I want to show you is the powerful ways of alignment inside of a grid. So let's set its height to 300 pixels, right? So I've got a grid with height of 300 pixels, and inside this cell, I'm going to add another grid. The other benefit of adding a grid inside a grid is that the inner grid can have fixed width and height. So let's say I want this grid to be 100 by 100, all right? And what I will do is, just so it's easier to track visually the changes, you can see this grid 100 by 100 has a green background. But in the parent grid, so I'll just click here, I've got a grid that's nested inside a cell, right? But you can see that that parent cell is quite big. The cool thing that we can do now is play around with the horizontal and vertical align options. But before we can do that, we just need to change one setting here, and that will activate the vertical aligned. Now I can align that inner grid inside the cell to the center horizontally, or to the vertical center, or let's say I want top right. There we go. Or bottom right, or bottom left. Bottom left, left, and bottom. There we go. So you can see how it's easy to pretty much place your content anywhere on the screen by having a grid with a fixed height, and then inside the cell of that grid placing another grid with fixed height and width, and then you can move it anywhere on the screen, because now I can add here an image or a button, whatever I want, exactly positioned exactly on the screen where I want it to be. Right, so that was those are still some of the, let's say, basic operations that you can do inside a grid and a cell, but combination of those with the combination of those options, you can achieve pretty much any visual alignment, any visual expression that you want on the page, right? And again, all of the content is always placed inside a cell, which is a child element of a grid, and you can control both the cell options and the grid options from the sidebar here. So I hope this video was useful. In the next video, I'm going to show you how I built one specific block for a hero section based off a design from a Figma file. Right, I'll see you next one.